Basic Brewing Radio is sponsored in part by the American Homebrewers Association. Summer is the perfect time to embark on a homebrewing adventure. Join the American Homebrewers Association for 1 year and receive a free brewing book of your choice to fuel your experience. Discover the joy of enjoying your own cold, crisp beer on a sunny day. Plus, get a free book to spark your beery inspiration. So join the American Homebrewers Association and start tapping into the joys of brewing. Visit homebrewersassociation.org/basicbrewing for offer details. homebrewersassociation.org/basicbrewing. Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, July 27th, 2023. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Alex Gruber, Tech Support Specialist at Imperial Yeast, gives us the details on diacetyl. What is it? Where does it come from? Do all beers have it? What can we do to get rid of it? And is it always bad? If you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/basicbrewing, and thanks to everybody who is helping out in that way. If you go to patreon.com/basicbrewing, you can see a long list of stuff that you can access if you sign up as a supporter. Financial supporters will get an early release of our next video episode this week. We're still on the pond, one more time, in the heat, as we share two of Steve's delicious meads. The first is a mulberry mead made with juice that we got out of our trial run of the steam juicer. That was the first time we used it. The second mead is a special, simple, sparkling mead from New Mexico honey that Steve made for his son's upcoming wedding. And boy, that was very champagne-y and delicious. That was a fun day. It was hot. Not as hot as it's been since then, but Steve and I are going to get together later this week in the air conditioning, back in the kitchen, to shoot 3 more shows. We're going to sample my Honey Peach IPA that I brewed with Imperial I-10 Mangostini, the cold IPA that Matt Giovanisi from Brew Cabin sent us, and Steve's take on a hot dog beer inspired by Ken Kazmierski's Chicago dog beer. Steve used a tincture of hot dog ingredients for his beer as opposed to putting the ingredients into the fermenter with the beer like Ken did. Looking forward to tasting to see how it turned out. Matt Giovanisi and I got together, and then I swear we'll stop talking about hot dog beer. Matt Giovanisi and I got together yesterday to sample his cold IPA for this show and to formulate a recipe for a red IPA that I'm going to brew. In that beer, we call for more of the leftover ingredients that I have on hand, mostly from HomebrewCon. In fact, I guess it's all from HomebrewCon now. Along with fresh ingredients from HighGravityBrew.com, and some fun hops, one of which I can't remember. I don't think I've brewed with it. I'm planning to run that show next week. And then the week after that, I have an interview that we recorded with Billy Belts of Lost Cause Meadery in San Diego. Man, what a delicious tasting we had there, and a great conversation with Billy. Tim Lieber, Meadman Tim Lieber, joined us for that conversation. That's the last of the shows that we recorded in June at HomebrewCon in San Diego. I mentioned I-10 Mangostini from our friends and sponsors at Imperial Yeast. That's the latest naturally hybridized, not GMO, yeast from Imperial. I fermented my Honey Peach IPA with it, and it was delicious. It was bubbling before bedtime, and the next morning that airlock was chugging like a steam train. And I said to myself, Self, this Mangostini is acting like a Kveik yeast. Well, if you watch one of the latest episodes from Chop and Brew on YouTube, Chip interviews Imperial R&D manager Ryan Moore about Mangostini, and Ryan says that Mangostini is a hybrid between A43 Loki, a Kveik yeast, and another previously unreleased Kveik strain. So it's Kveik. It's a hybrid Kveik strain. So cheers to Chip for that interview. I was assuming that Imperial was keeping the two strains close to their vest because it wasn't in the ad copy that I got for them. But there you go. I've been scooped. So when I pitch mangostini in my red IPA, I might pitch a little warmer than usual. Not hot porch temperature, but maybe around 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 C. Man, that's going to be a fun one. You know we love Imperial Yeast with 200 billion cells in each easy-to-open package. My stir plate is dusty because I don't use it anymore to make starters for moderate gravity 5-gallon batches, and my airlocks are usually bubbling before bedtime. And if you use mangostini, apparently they'll nearly shoot off the top of the thing. Ask your mileage may vary. Ask your local homebrew shop about I-10 mangostini and all of the dependable deliciousness from Imperial Yeast, and check them out at imperialyeast.com. It's imperialyeast.com. Okay, Alex Gruber gave a talk at HomebrewCon all about diacetyl, and you can find that if you're a member of the American Homebrewers Association. You can find that online. But we caught up with him outside the expo floor and talked about diacetyl. Steve and I did. I learned a whole lot. Alex makes a highly technical topic easy to understand. Alex Gruber, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks. It's good to be with you again.
Steve Wilkes.
Hey, James.
You ready to talk about diacetyl?
I'm always ready to talk about diacetyl. Hand me that popcorn.
I made you make a face yesterday, Alex. I told you the story about when I went to the Great Taste of the Midwest in Madison, and someone had a movie popcorn Pilsner at their booth, and you made a face.
I think I'm making that face again. It's I don't love that excuse for having diacetyl in a beer, even if it is intentional.
So does that pretty much describe what diacetyl is?
Yeah, it's a good baseline, I think, for kind of thinking about what diacetyl is. It depends on the individual. It can be perceived a little bit differently. We're all going to have kind of different background experiences, and that's how we kind of perceive aromas and flavors and what we imagine them as. So for some people, it's butterscotch, buttered popcorn, butter. It really depends. It can even be a little bit fruity for some people. It's less offensive. And it also depends on the concentration that it's at. But yeah, buttered popcorn is really the typical way that it comes across, unfortunately.
And is there a tactile sensation associated with it as well?
Yeah, there can be, and this is actually something I talked about in my presentation earlier. The mouthfeel aspect is for people there's some people who are diacetyl blind in terms of aroma. They just don't pick it up. And so the mouthfeel, kind of a slickness or a fullness it can add to a beer. But what's difficult about that is it's not always the case, and it depends on the style of beer that it's in, and even that isn't always going to be the case. But I use as an example when I was in my presentation, there's a study from 92 that was dosing diacetyl into different styles of beer. I think it was a pale ale, a lager, and a bitter, all at the same concentrations at varying concentrations. And in the pale ale, the diacetyl dosed at a certain concentration came off as adding fullness, kind of a roundness to the beer, kind of a pleasant addition, whereas that same concentration in the lager, you would imagine it would do the same thing, maybe even more so. It actually did the opposite, and the perception of the beer was actually quite watery, added less mouthfeel. So it's not always something you can count on, but if you do find yourself being diacetyl blind, you can look for the mouthfeel and kind of a slickness or a fullness that it can add.
Is it always bad?
No, it's not always bad. I mean, it's according to the BJCP style guidelines, it's always optional. It's never required. There are certain styles where I think it can be more beneficial and not just allowed. Specifically, sweet stouts tend to benefit from a little bit of diacetyl, but that doesn't mean it's required in any way. And it's also, if you're making your own beer, if you're home brewing, it's a question, are you brewing to style or are you brewing for beer that you like? And if you like what a little bit of diacetyl does in your beer, then there's nothing wrong with it at all. But if you're trying to nail a specific style, according to guidelines, it's always optional. It's never required.
Steve and I were talking earlier, and Steve, you said that you don't remember experiencing diacetyl in your beer, right?
No, not really. I was trying to think about this talk and trying to remember it. Do I remember making any diacetyl bombs? I'm certain I've made beer with diacetyl in it, but I don't remember having one that it just went, oh my God, I just made buttered popcorn. So my comment to you and I was just, I don't remember dealing much with diacetyl. But then I have a question though. So as a home brewer, would you recommend that in general we shoot for no diacetyl, meaning like don't try to put diacetyl in your beer?
I think, that's a really great question, and I think it's I'm going to answer a slightly different question, because I think the important question is can you actually control how much diacetyl is produced? And the answer is, to an extent, you can tweak certain things, but really no. Healthy yeast is going to produce diacetyl. I should say healthy, non-genetically engineered yeast, so normal brewing yeast, will naturally produce diacetyl, and if it is healthy, it will take it back up and reduce it down to less aromatic compounds. So as a home brewer, trying to get no diacetyl, like if you're at day 2, day 3 of fermentation and you're smelling diacetyl, don't freak out. It's okay. That's very normal. In fact, that's what a healthy fermentation looks like. So it'll be a little bit strain dependent, but aiming for no diacetyl is, even at the professional brewing level, we used to split hairs over parts per billion because we would get that stuff measured. And it's just, at the end of the day, sometimes it's worth more stress than it's more stress than it's really worth. So at the end of the day, if you're not smelling it in your final beer and it doesn't pop up later too, that's the important thing, then, don't worry too much about it, I guess.
So, I was just going to say, so if you haven't smelt it, you didn't dealt it.
Yeah, better out than in. So chances are in maybe every beer fermentation, it's expressed at some point, and then if everything goes well, it's eaten back up or it's taken back in. And does it change into a different compound, or does it just settle out with the yeast and you don't get it?
No, so it changes into a different compound. So diacetyl and 2,3-pentane-dione is the other compound that is part of the VDKs, the vicinal diketones that we talk about, but they can be thought of as kind of the same thing for practical purposes. But diacetyl is formed as a byproduct of valine and isoleucine production, which are 2 amino acids that the yeast needs to make for proteins. And then as a byproduct, this diacetyl is made for various reasons that probably aren't very fun to explain unless I have a diagram to show, which we don't have here. But that diacetyl, basically, once it is in solution, the yeast will take it back up and reduce it down to acetone and then 2,3-butane-diol, both of which are significantly less aromatic. So the diacetyl doesn't settle out. The diacetyl is actually reduced by the yeast cells. And this is why it's important to get healthy yeast cells at the end of your fermentation and keep your yeast happy all the way through. Because if your yeast isn't happy at the end of your fermentation, it's not going to take that diacetyl up as efficiently as it would if it were happy.
So if you underpitch, if you've got dead or dying yeast that are tired, they're ready to quit, they can't finish the job.
That's exactly right, yeah. And I won't say an underpitch will always cause that, but the second part of that, yes, if you have dead and dying yeast, then it's not going to be happy. Underpitches are kind of complicated. You can get more cell growth sometimes if you treat them right. But basically, if you're taking care of your yeast and you're within a relatively acceptable range for your pitch rate, then the yeast should take care of things for the most part. It shouldn't be something you need to worry about too much.
I mean, since the yeast is creating it and then taking it back up, why? I mean, what's the function? What's it doing?
This is a great question. So to go back to that, the way diacetyl is actually formed is, so alpha-acetolactate is a compound that's formed as part of that valine synthesis. Alpha-acetolactate is somewhat toxic to yeast cells. We don't fully understand what happens here, but there's kind of a backup in the process of making valine, and this alpha-acetolactate builds up in the cell. And a lot of it gets excreted out of the cell into your beer as it's fermenting. This alpha-acetolactate then spontaneously becomes diacetyl. And so the question is kind of like, why is the yeast excreting this? And we just don't really have a great answer for that. We do think it's like a toxicity prevention thing, but we're not totally sure. And so the diacetyl doesn't really serve much of a purpose. It's just this alpha-acetolactate going into solution spontaneously becomes diacetyl. And then when the yeast does reuptake the diacetyl, it does get some energy out of that. It's a small thing that it can do to just get a little bit more energy in the process, because that's all the yeast really cares about. It doesn't care if you have diacetyl in your beer. It just wants to survive and get more energy.
So what are the factors? I mean, does every recipe have equal potential in expressing or having diacetyl expressed, or do certain styles and certain ingredients, are they more? I mean, we know that lagers, because you're fermenting at a colder temperature, that's one factor. But do the ingredients that you choose some ingredients, do they have a better chance of having those, the diacetyls expressed?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think the answer is probably yes, but if we're able to... The reason the answer is yes is because some certain grains that you use are probably going to have a lower valine content than other grains, and if you have a low valine content in your wort, the yeast is going to sense that, and it's going to spur itself to produce more valine. And it's that valine synthesis that makes more diacetyl be produced. And so, sure, if you could measure the specific amino acids in your malts that you're using, you could potentially say, okay, hey, this one doesn't have very much valine. I shouldn't be using this, or I need to supplement it with something that has higher valine. We just don't have the ability to measure that. We do understand that's kind of how the process works. But to answer your question, not really. It's going to be more dependent on yeast. Certain yeast strains will be a little bit more of a diacetyl problem than others. In particular, for us, A09 Pub is a common strain. It's a great flocculator, but because of that yeast can crash out of solution really quickly, and you do need some yeast in solution to clean this back up. So someone asked a great question during my talk, kind of about if there's a correlation between flocculation and diacetyl production or diacetyl problems, and I said at the ends of that spectrum, I think so. So yeast that stays in solution really well is going to clean up diacetyl a little bit easier, and yeast that really just rockets to the bottom of your fermenter once it's done is going to cause some diacetyl issues. But in between, it's not necessarily going to be a linear thing. Just because something flocculates a little bit better, as long as it's staying in solution long enough to clean up the diacetyl, there's not always going to be a correlation between flocculation and that.
So if you have a beer that you fermented with a very flocculent yeast, that's where I haven't been drinking, and it settles out, and you're tasting, or you're sensing, or you're afraid that there might be some diacetyl, and we can talk about how you actually test for it. But can you then just rouse the yeast back up into solution, and then would it get back to work, or is it too late at that point?
It's probably too late at that point. The yeast, once it flocculates, it creates what are literally called flocks, and they're just bigger groups of yeast. And so even if you kind of throw those back into solution, they're going to want to fall out pretty quickly again, and they're really not interested in doing a whole lot of work if you're throwing them back into solution. So it might work to an extent, but it's definitely not going to be the most efficient way to deal with a diacetyl problem. Really what you want to be doing at that point is you want to kreuzen your beer, get some actively fermenting beer, or start up a small starter and get that in there and let that yeast take care of it. Maybe even if you use something like a pub for your main fermentation and you're having diacetyl issues, use something like an A07 flagship or a Chico strain that's going to be more typical, just to finish up that last little bit. It's not going to do any serious flavor production, but just add a touch of it in there and try to do that.
So there is hope.
There's definitely hope, yeah. Very rarely is there not hope.
Yeah, well, you actually answered my question. I was thinking about repitching, just pitching a different strain, a cask conditioning strain, something like that to just clean it up. Yeah, makes sense.
So what are the factors? We talked about temperature, and and we might want to expand on that some more, but I want to talk about all the risk factors. What are the factors that could influence your beer to have too much diacetyl in there, but let's talk about temperature first. Yeah. We can't assume that everybody knows about diacetyl rests in lagers and things like that, but talk about the role of temperature in creating or controlling diacetyl.
Yeah, so I was kind of talking about that step where alpha-acetolactate is excreted from the cell and exists and then becomes diacetyl. This is the slow step in this whole process, the alpha-acetolactate becoming diacetyl. And this is important because if you have alpha-acetolactate in solution, one way or the other, it is going to become diacetyl. It's just a question of how quickly it becomes diacetyl. And the yeast can't clean it up until it becomes diacetyl. And so you want that step to happen as quickly as possible. And two things make that step happen faster, two practical things at the home brewing level. One is temperature, like you're getting at. At warmer temperatures, that alpha-acetolactate conversion to diacetyl happens faster. And so that's why I showed a graph in my presentation where fermentation ran at 20 degrees Celsius, gets a higher diacetyl peak, but cleans up diacetyl quite a bit faster compared to like a 15 degree where you don't get as high of a peak, but it takes almost twice as long to clean up the diacetyl, or a 13 degrees Celsius fermentation. I think that's like 59 and 55 degrees or something like that. And so that temperature for that step is super important. Basically, you just get diacetyl faster at warmer temperatures. And the other thing is pH. The pH of your fermentation plays a big role. At higher pH, so particularly if you get above 4.5, 4.6, you can get slower conversion of that alpha-acetolactate to diacetyl compared to if you were at a pH of 4 or something like that. You get a much faster conversion. And so those are two big factors, temperature and pH, that really are going to keep that process moving and make sure that you get diacetyl formed while your yeast is still healthy and can take it back up and reduce it. That's why that's important to get that step happening quickly. Because if it takes a really long time, your yeast is maybe going to flocculate out, maybe just not be very healthy, and then you're going to get this late formation of diacetyl, and you're going to have a problem on your hands.
So you want to create the problem quickly so that they can take it's not you're not trying to avoid creating the problem. You want to create it in time for something to be fixed.
Absolutely. This is something you are going to have to deal with, so you might as well just deal with it.
Later today, I'm going to get the ingredients for my red IPA from our friends and sponsors Desiree and Dave of HighGravityBrew.com. No spoilers, but I'm going to pick up 12 pounds of base malt and 4 different varieties of hops. It's easy to get your ingredients for your beers on HighGravityBrew.com using the Build Your Own Beer page. You start out by essentially creating a bundle for your beer. You can name it, choose to have it milled or not, and then scroll through the inventory of a well-stocked homebrew store all on one page. And then after you've added all your ingredients, you send that beer to your cart and start on the next one. Or check out all the ingredient kits on HighGravityBrew.com that are all formulated already for you, many of which have been tested at Pippin's Tap Room, so you know they're delicious. Of course, you can check out all the Warthog electric brewing systems and controllers that are designed to take the pain out of propane. And if you use the code EBC75BB on HighGravityBrew.com, you can save $75 off your Warthog electric purchase. Send some love to Desiree and Dave and thank them for their long-time support of this show. That's at family-owned and operated HighGravityBrew.com. That's HighGravityBrew.com. What are the other factors that we've got to keep in mind?
So there are a couple other things to keep in mind. Really, I talked a little about just keeping your yeast happy. Part of that is pitch rate, like we mentioned, making sure that you get it in there at a good pitch rate, making sure that your yeast gets oxygen. This is another thing. So for the yeast to be able to take up the diacetyl, it needs to have a good, healthy cell membrane. Oxygen is what it uses to build the lipids for the cell membrane. So making sure your yeast gets plenty of oxygen and it's able to maintain its cell membrane and make new cells, because you want cells to be growing in a good fermentation. So making sure you start with a good pitch rate, making sure that you get oxygen, and then just if you have higher gravity beers or you're using high adjunct beers, maybe corn or rice, or even if you're using dextrose or something like that, you have to be aware that you might need to increase your pitch rate for those higher gravity beers, or you might need to add some yeast nutrient for those high adjunct beers, because there's just not going to be enough nitrogen in there for the tea.
Most of the time, a beer wort, straight all-grain beer wort, will have enough stuff for the yeast tea.
Absolutely. You're just going to be A-okay with all malt worts. Yeah.
This may be a side topic, but there's a relationship between the pitch rate and oxygen availability. Can pitching more yeast sort of diminish the need for oxygen, and then vice versa?
Well, that's a really interesting question. In terms of how it functions with diacetyl cleanup, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's a really good question. Yeah.
But if you're pitching a questionable amount of yeast, but you dose with lots of pure oxygen, or if you're like me and you pitch plenty of healthy yeast and you just shake the carboy, do those two factors kind of, if they're out of balance, you know what I'm saying? If you get more of one, does it diminish the need for the other?
I think the second one that you talked about, where you're pitching plenty of yeast, but you maybe don't oxygenate it a ton, you shake your carboy or something. I'm less concerned about that than I would be about a situation where you're pitching a questionable amount or a questionable quantity or quality of yeast, because even if you get more oxygen in there, you might get some cell growth, but you're going to be carrying over a lot of cells that aren't in great condition. And so that could lead to a problem down the road where you're needing them to take it back up. It's difficult to grow cells out of an unhealthy population because you're just going to be dealing with a lot of problems. So,
can you get diacetyl from, say, a contamination with your, so it's not just you do everything right, you don't pitch enough yeast or whatever, but if you do everything right, can there be outside factors that cause diacetyl in your beer?
Yeah, absolutely. So some strains of lactic acid bacteria, so lactobacillus, can create diacetyl, and so can pediococcus. These are not, they're brought up a lot, I think, in home brewing circles. People talk about them, and I think it's a good thing to be aware of. They're not very common when these things happen. And when they do happen, the concentrations of diacetyl that you'll get are through the roof. Like, these are huge concentrations, and they won't happen very quickly. So this guy, I was having a conversation earlier, someone was asking about they were getting diacetyl when they went to go bottle their beer and bottle condition it. And they were seeing diacetyl pop up just maybe 4 or 5 days after bottling. That's a short enough time frame where it's unlikely that it's going to be a contamination issue, and that's more likely just the bottle conditioning yeast doing its thing. It's kind of going through another fermentation again. It's creating some diacetyl, and then it needs to reduce it. If you have a bacterial contamination of some type, it's going to be something that shows up down the road, and it really will be very likely offensively intense.
I was going to say diacetyl may not be your biggest problem at that point. I broke my arm, but my neck is snapped.
So if you do get in that sense, if you do get diacetyl in bottle conditioning, is that a sign that you've not got enough healthy yeast in suspension and it's not doing its job well, or maybe you're drinking it too soon, and maybe cross your fingers, what yeast is in there is cleaning things up or going to clean things up?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about things, because you need yeast to do two things when you're bottle conditioning. You need it to carbonate your beer, but you also need it to create and then reduce this diacetyl. And it needs time. And so we were talking about temperature. That's an important thing. If you're bottle conditioning your beer, keep it at a temperature where it's going to be able to clean up that diacetyl efficiently. So if you pull your beer out, you see, hey, you pop one open and you hear that nice sound when it's nice and carbonated, don't just stop there. Go ahead and taste the beer. Make sure that it's ready to go before you say take all your bottles out of your conditioning closet or whatever and throw them in your fridge. Make sure that it's cleaned up the diacetyl by that point. Yeah.
So there's a test that you can do to see if you've got bad levels of diacetyl in your beer. Talk about that.
Yeah, so there are lots of tests you can do at the professional or lab level. There are some really great ways to test and get specific levels of diacetyl, but that's really impractical even for most commercial brewers, and definitely unless you happen to have a spectrophotometer lying around your garage, it's probably not. Right.
Yeah, I've got a spare if you need one.
Right, exactly. So an easy way to do it is just called a forced diacetyl or forced VDK test. You essentially take 2 samples of your beer, degas them if you can, warm one of the samples up and hold it at about 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit for about 15 minutes, and then cool it down to the same temperature as the other sample. Also, mark your samples. Make sure you keep track of which one is which. And then, so once they're cooled to the same temperature, you're just going to do a sensory analysis on them. So smell the one that hasn't been warmed up first. I recommend starting by smelling. You can go back and taste if you want to later. But smell the one that hasn't been warmed up first, and then go to the one that's been warmed up and smell that. And what you're looking for here is basically if you have alpha-ketolactate, that compound I was talking about, hiding in solution that hasn't become diacetyl yet, this warming up of the beer is getting that to happen. So you can kind of tell something is going to be a problem down the road, and in this process you're converting it to diacetyl, and you'll smell it if it's there. If it One thing you need to be aware of, if you have hoppy beer, a lot of times this warming up process will create some not so pleasant smelling aromas. And so you need to be aware, you just cooked your beer. It might not smell great, so you really need to be paying attention to, you're looking for that buttered popcorn, butterscotch. Those are the things you're looking for. If it just smells not great, you're probably okay. But if it has those compounds, that probably means you need to continue with your diacetyl rest or fix the issue some other way.
Yeah, so do what we were talking about before in maybe introducing some new, fresh, healthy yeast in there to do the job.
Yeah, and I would say if you're within like a few days after you've reached terminal gravity, I would just recommend maintaining it at like a diacetyl rest temperature. So for a lager, if you're around 72 degrees, that's going to be A-OK. An ale, 72 degrees. A lager, 60 degrees is adequate. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, no, totally. No. If you're within a few days after terminal gravity is reached, that's going to be A-OK. If you're further out, it's unlikely that the yeast is going to be doing a lot of work, so you will want to think about krausening like you were talking about, or adding an actively fermenting something.
So if you want to be extra safe, if you're doing a lager fermentation, is there any sin in like doing the first few days at a nice lager temperature and then warming it up? Like, can you warm it up too prematurely for the style, or is that better than risking having diacetyl in the end?
Is this going to be broadcast in Germany? Because I might not be let in if I answer this a certain way. I would say no, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, so much of lager brewing is based on kind of like lore and just tradition, which is great, and it's part of the amazing thing about lager beer is there's so much tradition in it. But that doesn't mean you can't deviate from the norm. And yeah, I would say you're going to get the majority of your flavor formation in the first 60 to 80% of that fermentation. So if you can get that in 3-4 days and then you want to let that temperature increase, give it a try. It'll probably vary from strain to strain how successful that is, but it wouldn't be very concerning to me to do that.
Yeah, it seems like to me that you should get most of your character or lack thereof early on when there's so much activity in the beer, and it seems like that you maybe get less fruity off flavors or whatever you're afraid of when you're fermenting a lager later on.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that the timelines we've been talking about for kind of how long to let that look for the diacetyl to be cleaned up after you reach terminal gravity, those are kind of ale timelines. Lager timelines are all going to be extended a little bit. And even if you want to leave lagers 3-4 weeks before you start to worry with the diacetyl in solution, I think that's okay. It's just a longer process in general.
Yeah, is the diacetyl rest just kind of a shortcut? I mean, if you were to maintain a nice low fermentation temperature in your lager where the yeast is happy doing their primary fermentation, and you just left it alone for a long period of time, would the yeast eventually take care of or would those diacetyls be created and then have a chance to be taken care of, or is it maybe yeast dependent?
It's that last part is right. It's yeast dependent. It's going to be yeast and fermentation dependent. So there's probably certain strains that'll do that really well. In particular, like for us, L13 Global is a 3470 strain. Really not much of a diacetyl producer. It's just not something I'm worried about. Some of the Munich lager strains can get a little bit more diacetyl-y, and I'd be a little bit more worried about not doing a diacetyl rest with those ones. But yeah, at the homebrew level, you see how it works on your system, and if it didn't work out, the next time give it a diacetyl rest. I don't think there's ever anything wrong in that last 20% of your active fermentation, letting that temperature rise, letting that diacetyl clean up and giving it a chance. And then if you want to lager it, crash it back down once you've ran that forced diacetyl test, made sure there's no diacetyl, crash it and let it do its thing. If you lager it however you want.
And if you do get some buttery off flavors, just tell your friends it's a popcorn beer.
Yeah, just don't tell them too loud.
Not around your beer friends, your neighbors. Oh, and one weird kind of off question. Did I hear a few years ago that diacetyl was named a carcinogen? And I remember people talking about specifically making buttered popcorn, like microwave buttered popcorn. They used diacetyl, right, to get the buttery flavors. And I had heard, did I hear that it's a carcinogen?
It is, but I think you kind of have to think about that like anything is toxic at high enough levels. So I think it was actually, if I remember this right, there were some people working in a popcorn factory who started to develop what they actually call diacetyl lung. And it's a condition that was actually really horrible. I think only outside of the people working in the factory, there was one person who literally ate 2 bags of popcorn a day who started to have symptoms and had an issue with it. But yeah, it's not like it. Like anything, you have it at a high enough level and it's not going to be good. But acetaldehyde is another one of those things that's not very good for you and is going to happen in beer. So, yeah, just do a diacetyl rest and make sure you're not ingesting too much.
I hear ethanol's not good for you either.
Yes, it's true. Yeah.
Right. If you're going to worry about things, worry about that.
Right. Yeah. I think ethanol has probably been deemed a carcinogen as well, but I'm not sure about that.
At least you can't catch diacetyl from the toilet seat.
Can you?
I'm not sure about that.
We haven't done any studies on that, Steve.
No, nor shall we.
Any more questions, Steve?
No, I'm done.
Is there anything that we've missed that you think that you should put out there?
I don't think so. I think it's worth mentioning that hop creep is a really interesting aspect when it comes to diacetyl. We didn't really touch on it in my talk because it kind of deserves attention unto itself. But it is an issue just at the homebrew level. You need to be aware if you are dry hopping your beers, that can cause some diacetyl issues, and it's a bit of a separate consideration, but it's something to be aware of at the very least.
There's always something. Well, Alex, thanks for your information and your help.
Absolutely. It's great to be with you guys again. It was good to chat with you.
Well, thanks again to Alex. That's the kind of knowledge that's available at our friends and sponsors, Imperial Yeast. I'd like to bring him back on the show. He's a lot of fun to talk to. If you have brewing questions in the meantime, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to James at basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form at basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our mobile-friendly shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way, as always. Check that out at patreon.com/basicbrewing. It's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. In the meantime, stay well and stay tuned. So long.